I grew up in the shadow of my twin brother, who eventually even took my wife away from me, but despite this I stayed with my beloved son. Hey Reddit, throw away here. I'm not even sure where to start because my world feels like it's been flipped upside down. Honestly, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but here's my story. To give some context, I, 32M, have a twin brother, Adam. People always assume that being twins means you're inseparable, like built-in best friends, but that wasn't our story. Growing up, Adam was always the golden child, and I was, well, just, the other one. I'm not saying I was neglected, but let's just say my parents' priorities were clear. Adam was the one they believed in, the one they thought would do something great. Me. No matter what I did, it was never enough. I worked hard in school, brought home awards, even won competitions, but all I ever got was a polite, good job. Meanwhile, Adam would barely scrape by in school, and they'd throw a whole party if he managed to pass a class. By the time I hit my teens, I stopped trying to impress them. What was the point? I decided the best thing for me was to focus on getting out. As soon as I turned 18, I left home. I wasn't even sure what my plan was, but I knew I needed space to figure things out on my own. It wasn't easy at first. I worked long hours at whatever job I could find, from stocking shelves to waiting tables, saving up every penny I could. Eventually, I scraped together enough to open a small coffee shop. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and for the first time, I felt like I was building something that mattered. That's when I met Emily, 29F. She walked into my cafe one morning, and I don't know what it was, her smile, her laugh, but we clicked immediately. She became a regular, and before I knew it, I found myself looking forward to every moment we spent together. Over time, we started dating, and it just felt right. Emily was everything I'd ever hoped for in a partner, supportive, kind, and grounded. Life started falling into place. After a few years together, I proposed, and not long after, we found out Emily was pregnant. Our son, Jamie, was born 7 years ago, and I can honestly say that was one of the happiest days of my life. Holding him in my arms, I felt like I was finally building the kind of family I'd always wanted. Now, my relationship with my parents and Adam remained distant. I'd see them occasionally, mostly around holidays, but we weren't exactly close. Still, they doted on Jamie, and for a while, I thought we'd reached a place where things were okay. Adam would visit sometimes, too, and although we weren't particularly close, I figured we were at least civil. For the most part, life was good. My business was thriving, Emily and I were happy, and Jamie was growing up into an amazing little kid. But then, something happened recently, something I never saw coming, that has completely shattered the life I thought I had. For the last 7 years, Jamie has been the center of my world. Watching him grow, learn, and develop his little personality has been the most rewarding experience of my life. Emily and I worked hard to give him the best we could, a stable home, love, and a future full of opportunities. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. A few months ago, we had a scare that no parent ever wants to face. Jamie had a minor accident while playing outside, something most kids bounce back from without issue, but this time, it turned serious. He ended up in the hospital and needed a blood transfusion. Emily and I immediately told the doctors we'd do whatever was necessary. I was sure one of us would be a match, but that's when things got strange. They ran routine tests to determine compatibility, and the nurse returned with a concerned look on her face. She told us neither of us were a match. I remember laughing nervously, thinking there must have been some kind of mix-up. I mean, how could neither Emily nor I match Jamie? But the nurse gently assured me that mistakes like this were incredibly rare. She even offered to retest, but I could tell from her expression that she didn't think the results would change. For a moment, I thought back to biology lessons in high school. Blood types aren't something you think about daily, but suddenly, I couldn't stop replaying the basics in my head. My blood type is AB. Emily's is A. Jamie's blood type was something else entirely. I told myself there had to be some kind of explanation. Maybe it skipped a generation, or maybe there was a rare anomaly I didn't know about. But deep down, a sinking feeling was starting to take hold. After finding a donor match and getting Jamie the care he needed, the nurse suggested we look into genetic testing, just to clear up any confusion. Emily immediately shut down the idea. She said it was unnecessary and accused me of being paranoid. At first, I wanted to believe her, really, I did. But the more she dismissed the idea, the more uneasy I felt. I don't know if it was the stress of the situation or the way she avoided eye contact every time I brought it up, but something about her reaction didn't sit right with me. I knew I wouldn't be able to move on without answers, so I decided to do the test anyway. Emily didn't know I'd done it at first. I thought, maybe if the results came back normal, I could just let it go and chalk this up to one of those weird moments life throws at you. But when the envelope arrived in the mail, my entire world came crashing down. I stared at the envelope for what felt like hours. I didn't want to open it, but I knew I had to. My hands were shaking as I finally tore it open, pulling out the papers inside. The words were all a blur at first, medical jargon I didn't understand, but then I saw it. Probability of paternity, 0%. 0. I read the result over and over, hoping I'd misread it, that I was misunderstanding what it meant. But the truth was staring me in the face. Jamie wasn't my biological son. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My head was spinning, my chest tight. I kept trying to find some kind of explanation, some loophole, anything that could make sense of what I was reading. This had to be a mistake. It had to be. When Emily came home later that evening, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I confronted her, the papers still in my hand. At first, she tried to act confused, like she didn't understand what I was talking about. But as I pressed her, her facade started to crack. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she begged me to stop, saying it wasn't what I thought. I asked her point blank, "Who is Jamie's father?" She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. And that's when she said it. "It's Adam." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. "Adam? My brother Adam?" She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. I can't even describe what I felt in that moment. Rage. Betrayal. Shock. It was like a tidal wave of emotions, each one crashing into me harder than the last. My brother. The person I'd spent my whole life trying to escape. The one who always had everything handed to him. Now he'd taken this from me, too. Emily started apologizing, trying to explain, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of my own thoughts. I barely remember the rest of that conversation. All I know is that I walked out of the house and didn't stop until I was halfway across town. I ended up sitting in my car for hours, replaying everything over and over. How could this have happened? How could the two people I trusted most betray me like this? When I finally went home, Emily was waiting for me, still in tears. She begged me to stay, saying it had been a mistake and that she regretted it every day. She tried to justify it, saying it happened during a rough patch in our relationship, that she thought we wouldn't last. But none of it mattered. The damage was done. The night Emily confessed was a blur. I don't even know how I managed to stay in the same house after hearing the truth. I kept thinking about Jamie, his smile, his laugh, the way he called me Dad without hesitation. To me, he was my son. But now, this revelation had tainted every memory. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Jamie playing in the living room. His laughter cut through the fog in my head, but it only made the ache in my chest worse. How could something so pure and innocent have come from such a betrayal? I decided to focus on Jamie that day, ignoring Emily's tearful attempts to talk. I wasn't ready to deal with her, not yet. Instead, I took Jamie to the park, just the two of us. I needed to clear my head, and being with him always made me feel like I was doing something right. But even at the park, I couldn't escape the truth. I watched him run around, playing with other kids, and my mind kept going back to the DNA test. The fact that Adam, my own twin brother, was Jamie's biological father felt like a bad joke. Every time I thought about it, my stomach churned. When we got home, I told Emily we needed to talk, but this time, it wasn't just about her. I needed answers about Adam. How long? I asked, keeping my voice steady, though inside I was anything but calm. Emily hesitated, wiping her eyes. It was, a few times. Years ago. Before we were married. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. So you were seeing him while we were together? She nodded. I was confused. You were so focused on your work, and Adam, he was just there. It didn't mean anything, I swear. It was a mistake. A mistake that lasted long enough to result in a child, I said, my voice rising. I could feel my temper slipping, but I forced myself to stay in control. Did he know? Did Adam know Jamie was his? Emily shook her head quickly. No, he doesn't know. I didn't tell him. I didn't tell anyone. I thought if I kept it to myself, it wouldn't matter. Her words only made me angrier. So you lied to me for 7 years. You let me believe Jamie was mine, while all this time, I couldn't even finish the sentence. She tried to take my hand, but I pulled away. I didn't want to hurt you, she whispered. Hurt me? Emily, you didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything. I couldn't be in the same room with her anymore. I grabbed my keys and left, not knowing where I was going, only that I needed to get away. After storming out of the house, I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind racing with every thought imaginable. I'd replayed Emily's words so many times they almost felt like background noise now. But one thing kept coming back, louder than everything else: Adam didn't know. The idea didn't sit right with me. If Adam didn't know Jamie was his, why had he always been around? Why was he suddenly so interested in my life after years of keeping his distance? Something wasn't adding up, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I finally decided I needed answers, from Adam. I wasn't sure how the conversation would go, but I wasn't about to let this fester any longer. When I got to his apartment, I had to fight the urge to just pound on the door. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself down, before knocking. A few seconds later, Adam opened the door, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Hey, man. What's up?" he said, grinning like nothing was wrong. I didn't return the smile. "We need to talk." His face fell, and he stepped aside to let me in. I could feel my pulse pounding as I walked into his living room, taking a seat on the couch. Adam sat across from me, looking uneasy. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious. I didn't waste time beating around the bush. "Emily told me everything." Adam blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "Everything? What are you talking about?" "She told me about Jamie," I said, my voice sharp. "About how he's your son." The color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it, but then he just slumped back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "She told you?" he muttered, almost to himself. "So you did know," I said, my voice rising. "You knew, and you've just been showing up to my house, playing the good uncle, like nothing's wrong." "It's not like that." Adam shot back, his voice defensive. "I didn't know for sure. I mean, I had a feeling, but Emily, she never told me anything. I thought it was better not to ask." "Better not to ask?" I repeated, standing up. "You slept with my girlfriend, my wife, and had a kid with her, and you thought it was better not to ask?" Adam stood up too, his expression shifting from defensive to angry. "You think this was easy for me? I messed up, okay. I know I did. But I didn't know how to fix it, and I figured as long as you were happy, it didn't matter." "It didn't matter," I said, my voice shaking. "You lied to me for 7 years, Adam. You let me believe Jamie was mine. Do you even understand what you've done?" He didn't answer, just looked away, guilt written all over his face. I didn't have the energy to keep yelling. The anger was still there, boiling under the surface, but I felt drained, like every ounce of fight had been pulled out of me. "I don't even know who you are anymore," I said quietly, heading for the door. "Wait," Adam called after me, but I didn't stop. I walked out without another word, slamming the door behind me. After confronting Adam, I drove home, but the weight in my chest only grew heavier. The conversation had left me reeling, emotions tangled between anger, betrayal, and exhaustion. How could Adam, my own twin, justify what he'd done? And how could Emily live with herself for keeping it all a secret for so long? When I walked into the house, Emily was sitting on the couch. Her face was puffy, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at me, her expression pleading, but I couldn't even bring myself to meet her gaze. I walked past her, heading straight to Jamie's room. Jamie was on the floor surrounded by his toys, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding just outside his door. He looked up when I walked in, his face lighting up in that way only kids can manage, pure and unaffected. For a moment, the sight of him brought some calm to the storm inside me. Sitting down beside him, I watched as he explained his latest building project, pointing out every detail with pride. I nodded along, even managing a small smile, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about what Emily had said before I left, how Jamie loved me, how I was the only father he knew. That part wasn't a lie. For Jamie, I was his dad. But knowing the truth changed everything. It didn't matter that none of this was his fault or that my love for him hadn't wavered. The foundation of my life, the trust one thought I had, was crumbling. I stayed with Jamie until he fell asleep, his tiny hand clutching one of his favorite toys. Watching him, I felt torn in a way I'd never experienced before. On one hand, I wanted to protect him from the truth, to shield him from the pain I was feeling. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore what had happened, the betrayal that had shattered everything I thought I knew. When I finally left his room, Emily was waiting for me. She didn't say anything, just looked at me with a mixture of guilt and desperation. Her silence felt louder than any words. I sat down across from her, the distance between us both physical and emotional. For years, I thought we were a team, building a life together, but now I realized how much of that life had been built on a lie. I couldn't even bring myself to speak. The weight of everything, Adam's betrayal, Emily's deceit, the uncertainty of what came next, pressed down on me until it felt suffocating. Emily's tears started again, but I didn't have the energy to comfort her. Instead, I stared at the floor, replaying every moment of the past 7 years in my head, trying to figure out when things had gone so wrong. For Jamie's sake, I knew I couldn't make any rash decisions. He was the innocent one in all of this, and no matter how much anger and pain I felt, I had to think about what was best for him. But as for Emily and Adam, I wasn't sure I could ever forgive them. The days that followed were a blur. I went through the motions of daily life, but the weight of everything lingered like a storm cloud over me. Emily tried to talk to me multiple times, but I kept my distance. The truth was, I didn't know what to say. No words felt adequate to express the mixture of betrayal and hurt I was carrying. Jamie, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware. Every time I saw him, it felt like a small relief and a fresh wound all at once. He'd call me Dad without hesitation, run to me with his latest drawing or story from school, and I'd do my best to be present for him. Yet, in the back of my mind, the truth loomed: I wasn't his biological father. At night, I'd lie awake, replaying the events over and over. I kept wondering if I'd missed signs along the way. Were there moments when Emily's guilt had slipped through? Did Adam's frequent visits have a deeper meaning that I had ignored? The questions were endless, and the answers felt just out of reach. I couldn't avoid Adam forever, and he must have sensed that. A few days after our confrontation, he called me. His voice on the other end of the line was hesitant, almost nervous, but he didn't apologize. Instead, he asked if we could meet again, saying there were things he needed to explain. Reluctantly, I agreed. A part of me wanted to hear what he had to say, even if I wasn't sure it would make any difference. We met at a neutral spot, a park near where we grew up. Seeing him there, standing awkwardly by a bench, brought a flood of childhood memories, most of them overshadowed by the favoritism and resentment that had always defined our relationship. Adam started talking before I even sat down. He admitted he'd always been jealous of me. It wasn't the kind of jealousy I'd expected, not about achievements or attention, but about the life I'd built after leaving home. He said he envied the independence I'd carved out, the way I'd managed to create something from nothing. When it happened, he said, his voice trailing off, it wasn't planned. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. I guess I just wanted something that was yours. That last sentence hit me harder than anything else he'd said. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was deliberate, a twisted way of taking what he thought I had that he didn't. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. The anger that simmered beneath the surface since Emily's confession was boiling over, but I wasn't sure what to do with it. Punching him wouldn't fix anything. Yelling wouldn't undo what had been done. After a long silence, I finally told him the only thing I could: you're not part of my life anymore. Don't come near me, don't come near Emily, and don't come near Jamie. You've taken enough from me. Adam didn't argue. He just nodded, his shoulders slumping, and walked away. As I watched him go, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. Cutting him out of my life was the only choice, but it didn't erase the damage he'd done. And deep down, I knew this was only one part of the battle. After my conversation with Adam, I thought I'd feel some sense of closure, but instead, the emptiness only deepened. Cutting him out of my life was necessary, but it didn't fix the damage. The betrayal was still there, raw and unrelenting, and I couldn't escape it no matter how hard I tried. Back at home, things between Emily and me were strained to the breaking point. She was trying, cooking meals I barely touched, offering apologies that felt hollow, and asking how we could fix things. But I didn't know if fixing things was even possible. One night, after Jamie had gone to bed, Emily tried again. She sat across from me at the table, her face weary from days of crying. She talked about counseling, about rebuilding trust, about doing whatever it took to save our marriage. I listened, but I didn't respond right away. My mind was too tangled in questions I couldn't answer. Could I forgive her? Would I ever be able to look at her the same way again? Every time I tried, the image of her and Adam together flashed in my head, and I felt like I was drowning all over again. I'm not sure I can do this, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. You didn't just break my trust, you shattered it. I don't know if it's something I can rebuild. Emily's face crumpled, but she didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I'll give you space, she said, her voice trembling. But please, don't give up on us yet. That night, I slept on the couch again. Not because Emily asked me to, but because the thought of sharing a bed with her felt impossible. The next morning, I started making plans. If there was one thing I knew for sure, it was that I needed clarity. Living in this state of limbo, with unresolved emotions and unspoken words, was eating away at me. I reached out to a lawyer, not to file for divorce just yet, but to understand my rights when it came to Jamie. I needed to know what my options were, how the courts would see my role as his father if things came to that. Talking to the lawyer was sobering. He explained that since I was listed on Jamie's birth certificate and had been raising him since birth, I'd likely still be considered his legal parent. The biological connection, or lack of it, wouldn't automatically strip me of that. It was both a relief and a new kind of heartbreak. Jamie was my son in every way that mattered to me, but the thought of having to defend my role in his life because of Emily and Adam's choices felt like another betrayal. Later that evening, Emily approached me with an envelope. She handed it to me without saying a word, her hands trembling. Inside were the results of a DNA test she had taken with Jamie. I wanted you to have this, she said, her voice barely audible. You deserve to see the truth for yourself. I didn't open it right away. Part of me felt like I already knew everything I needed to know, but another part of me needed the confirmation, no matter how much it hurt. When I finally unfolded the papers, the words were clear: Jamie wasn't biologically mine. Even though I already knew, seeing it spelled out was like a punch to the gut. I sat there, staring at the paper, while Emily quietly left the room. That night, I stayed up thinking about Jamie, about what he meant to me, and what the future might look like. No matter what the papers said, I couldn't imagine a life without him. But as for Emily, I wasn't sure if she'd have a place in that future. The days after the DNA results were suffocating. Jamie remained oblivious, but the weight of the truth lingered in every corner of the house. Emily and I barely spoke, and even Jamie started asking questions about why I wasn't sleeping in the bedroom. One night, as I tucked Jamie in, he asked, "Dad, are you mad at me?" The question broke me. I reassured him I wasn't, hugging him tightly, but it only solidified what I already knew: I couldn't let this limbo continue. The next morning, I sat Emily down. I told her I was filing for divorce. She didn't argue, just nodded through her tears, already knowing there was no going back. I assured her I wouldn't abandon Jamie. He's my son, I said, and I meant it. But I couldn't stay in a marriage where trust was gone. Within days, I moved into a small apartment nearby, ensuring Jamie's life stayed as stable as possible. Telling him about the separation was gut-wrenching, but I promised him nothing would change between us. As hard as it was, I knew this was the first step toward finding some semblance of peace, for both of us. The weeks following the separation were a whirlwind of adjustment. Moving into the apartment was bittersweet. On one hand, it was a space where I could breathe without the constant tension of Emily's presence. On the other, it was a stark reminder of everything I'd lost. Jamie adjusted better than I expected. He was resilient, like kids often are, but there were moments when his questions would cut through me. "Why can't we all live together?" he asked one evening during dinner at my place. I told him it wasn't his fault, that both his mom and I loved him deeply, but some questions didn't have easy answers. Emily and I maintained a civil relationship for Jamie's sake. We coordinated schedules, kept conversations short, and tried to keep things as normal as possible for him. But every interaction reminded me of the betrayal, and I couldn't help the lingering resentment that surfaced every time I saw her. Adam, on the other hand, stayed completely out of the picture. True to my word, I cut him off entirely. He'd reached out once, a short, guilt-ridden text, but I ignored it. Forgiveness might come someday, but I wasn't ready for that yet. Despite everything, my bond with Jamie remained strong. We spent weekends building Lego towers, exploring parks, and watching movies. He was my anchor, the one good thing that had come from this mess. Life wasn't easy, but with each passing day, I started to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe I'd never fully escaped the pain of what had happened, but I was learning to live with it, and to focus on what truly mattered.